Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Anthony Ryan. I am the Marketing and Sales Director at Ignatius Press. I want to welcome you today to this Facebook Live conversation with Father Timothy Gallagher and Chris McGregor. Today, as many of you know, is the feast of one of the greatest saints of modern times and maybe of any time, Saint Trez of Lisieux. So we thought it'd be a great day to have this conversation, not only about Therese, but also about her family, and in particular her sister, Leonie, who is a very interesting person, and then also about her family. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce my very honored guest today. Father Timothy Gallagher, who you see on the screen, is a member of the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, which is a religious community dedicated to retreats and spiritual formation according to the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And we kind of like him at Ignatius Press.
Yeah.
For many years, Father Gallagher has had an international ministry of retreat, spiritual direction, and teachings on the spiritual life. He's a frequent host and speaker on EWTN television. He's a writer of some 8 books on Ignatius discernment and prayer. He currently holds the St. Ignatius Chair for Spiritual Formation at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver. So, Father Gallagher, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
And then Chris McGregor, you see on the other part of the screen, founder and director of Discerning Hearts, which is dedicated to evangelization and spiritual formation through new media, and is a pioneer in creating podcasts, radio broadcasts, and publications faithful to the teachings of the Church. She currently hosts 9 radio programs on Spirit Catholic Radio Network, and she has Father Gallagher on often as a guest on Discerning Hearts. So we're very honored to have the two of you here together. I know you're very busy. And so thank you for coming. I know you're both very knowledgeable, great devotees of Saint Trez of Lisieux, whose feast day, as I mentioned, we're celebrating today. And also of her parents, 2 saints, Zélie. We could probably say Zélie in America, but it's Zélie and Louis Martin, canonized saints. And then we want to talk a little bit about her sister. I'm going to hold up her book, Leonie Martin, A Difficult Life. A very interesting woman. And you see Chris has her book there. Mm-hmm. The other book we'll touch on is called A Family of Saints, the Martins of Lisieux. And so there's a lot to cover, and our time is short, but we'll do the best we can to kind of just get into it. So I really want to start off with Leonie. So I was wondering, Father Gallagher, I know you love Leonie and you're knowledgeable of her. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about Leonie Martin, the sister of Trez.
Well, my guess would be that even those who really love Saint Therese, and maybe the parents now who are canonized and are aware that there were a number of sisters in the family, the one that they're most likely not to recognize or to know is Leonie. She's always lost in the shuffle, and she was during her lifetime, and she tends to be until recently. That's changing, and I'd say kind of dramatically today. Mm-hmm. I mean, the book that you held up is evidence of the fact that there was some years ago enough interest in her in English to translate and publish this book in English. But what Chris and I have just done this last summer is revealing a depth of interest I think that none of us could have foreseen. People love her because she was the problem child who never gave up, and the love of whose family and whose faith brought her to where her cause of canonization is now underway at Rome. It's a remarkable story of hope. That's what Chris called it. He speaks of her as a bearer of hope, which is a great title.
Chris, you want to add to that?
Well, I just am so grateful to Father Gallagher for doing so much research to bring Leonie's story more fully alive. I mean, really, it gave it it really elevated gave it up, rounded it out. That's what I want to say. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why we became attracted to her story is that a couple of years ago, we did a series on the letters of St. Therese. And this was right after we had a conference in Omaha, Discerning Hearts Conference, where you were there, Anthony. You were there, and it was on St. Therese. And I didn't even know her that well. I want to say, I mean, I understand the doctor of the church, Therese, and I knew a lot of her stories, the cute ones and everything else, but I didn't really understand the depth of St. Therese. And you had such a love for her that I thought I really would love to get to know her more. And Father Gallagher has, in conversations with him, I was surprised to find out that he was very much touched. I mean, these two important guys I know seem to have this affinity, and it have been inspired by the little flower. And you've gone on to do wonderful, beautiful things for the church. And
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. I don't know. So what I was going to say is, thank you. That's beautiful. You've obviously quickly grown in your knowledge and love of Trez.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for all the good work you do on discerning hearts regarding her, and so much good stuff. But you mentioned that she's a doctor of the church. I think that's a good thing for us to talk about a little bit as we move into this whole topic about this family. I mean, here's a woman who died when she was 24, unknown to the world, wasn't even appreciated much by her own sisters, who said when she died, well, what are we going to write about Trez in our inter-community newsletter? Mm-hmm. And yet, she is a doctor of the church. That is astounding. So I was wondering, Father Gallagher, maybe you could just talk about that a little bit. Why is she a doctor of the church? What is it about her that John Paul II wanted to declare her a doctor of the church, St. Trez of Lisieux?
Well, if you compare her to all the other doctors of the church, some remarkable things come out. Think of John Chrysostom, Francis de Sales, and the rest of them. But she never had any formal education past the age of 13. And yet her literary output surpasses that of John of the Cross. In her 24 years of life, she wrote more than John of the Cross did. She had a native intelligence. Today, if she were, in the secular world and were living that life, she would be very successful in any field that she might choose, because she was just humanly, she was brilliant. When you couple that with a very deep life of faith and a very rich setting of upbringing in the family, so that she knew, for example, that God could not be a severe judge because she witnessed her father and the love of her father and so forth. When you put all that together, you have the backdrop, as it were, for what happened, this incredible gift of grace. Chris and I went through her letters. Of course, it's all there in the Story of a Soul as well. But she has this remarkable ability to see clearly through things. Part of that's native human intelligence, but a bigger part of it is grace working within that. And she has a surety of intuition into things. She knows when things, even what everyone else is saying, this sort of Jansenist tinged view of God as severe and so forth, she just knows by instinct it's not right. Well, you put all that together and you get someone who is rightly a doctor of the church. And you do need to get past some of the sentimental quality of the language. And once you do that, you see the steel in it and the richness in it.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think an obstacle, as you say, for people initially with Trez is there's the flowery language and so forth. But once they get through that, I mean, the Story of the Soul is a publishing phenomenon. I mean, let's just talk about that for a second. She wrote that at the request of her superior, who was one of her own blood sisters, just because they wanted her to write down her own experiences, memories of her life, and her spiritual insights. And, she just wrote it and turned it in and, just figured, well, okay, that's the end of that. I did that out of obedience. And then it just became this incredible spiritual classic, published in who knows how many languages and how many millions and millions of copies, The Story of a Soul, and the impact that book has had on people, on their faith, on religious vocations, conversions. It's just astounding. And so that probably has something to do with her becoming a doctor of the church, just what was in that book, besides the other writings you say she did. A lot of people don't know that Trez wrote as much as you said. I mean, that's kind of a revelation for a lot of people. Usually the church makes someone a doctor of the church because there's something they bring, kind of a charism or a special gift for the church that's unique, that's kind of hasn't really been focused on before. What is it about her teaching, would you say, that was so unique? What was it?
Well, I'll just say very succinctly, if you look at the talk that St. John Paul II gave when he went to Lisieux, and then also the document declaring her as a doctor, the essence of it is this, that she brings to the fore again the core of the gospel. There's nothing really new about it, but what she does is she brings to light the heart of the gospel, which is this immense love of God. And think of the First Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit. It's all there. Sometimes I think you can summarize all of Therese in the First Beatitude. The joyful quality of poverty of spirit, depending upon God with such great confidence. So against the backdrop of a pastoral practice and a view of God, which was, as I said, tinged with a sense of heaviness, out of nowhere, as it were, comes this miracle of grace, this doctor of the church who recaptures the heart of the gospel. And that's why everyone loves her, because, it's not as hard as I thought. God is closer to me than I thought. There's more hope than I thought. I'm going to stop there, Chris. It's your turn.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
Well, I would only say if you want to see Therese's doctrine in action, if you want to see how possible it is, then you look to her sister Leonie, because she looked like it was impossible. She was the smallest. She was the most forgotten of the Martin. Well, I mean, we don't even know. If you ask people, all the devotees of Therese, what sister? Whose sister? And if they do know of her, they would say, well, she was the difficult one. She was the problem child. But they don't go into the depths of it, And one of the reasons for Therese's cause going forward as strongly as it did is because they looked at the life of Leonie and how she lived it out. She help me, Father Gallagher. Wasn't she referred to as the apostle of Therese? And something to that nature, wasn't it?
Yeah, she's considered the first disciple of Therese, and I'd say first both chronologically, because she begins to absorb this even while Therese is alive, but especially after the publication of The Story of a Soul, which was published a year after Therese died. And that book just revolutionized Leonie's life, because she said, this is my way. I can do this. And she consciously and repeatedly in her letters speaks of Therese as her spiritual director. So she was first chronologically, but I would also say, very much as you're saying, Chris, she was also first, I would say, inspirationally, or in an exemplary fashion, because you know how Therese says in The Story of a Soul that if God could find a soul weaker and more poor than I, then he would pour out even greater graces. And Leonie understood herself, and humanly speaking, she was right, to be that soul that was poorer and weaker. And that transformed everything. This woman whose life could have easily ended in isolation and bitterness and a sense of rejection, and hopelessness. What was her, as her uncle said, what would she ever do? That teaching of Therese changed everything for her. And that's why, as you call her, Chris, a bearer of hope, she really is. Because what you see is if this woman can undergo this kind of transformation, then there's not one of us who has to feel bound and hopeless. Every one of us that's available. Very few, very, very few of us will ever start from a situation as humanly poor and limited as Leonie's. And yet grace, look what grace does.
Thank you, Father, because Tony, when you really look at Leonie, how I discovered her was when we were going through the letters of Saint Therese very methodically with Father Gallagher, and I was beginning to see just how rich this woman Therese was. To do that, Father lined up and began looking at her mother and her father and the family, because Therese, it was born out of this garden that was so richly sown by the blood, sweat, and tears and love and prayers of this incredible Martin Gurin, I hope I say it right, Gurin family, so Zelly's brother and sister. Just as a quick footnote, Tony, you need to know that original letter, that tome of Story of the Soul, correct me, Father Gallagher, if I'm wrong, but the first 2,000 copies were paid for by Isidore, her uncle.
That's right.
And he's the one. It took the family. A family makes saints. That's why I'll just say, this is so good. Get to know this family. This is a family of saints. Yeah. I mean, there are heroes throughout this whole story. But there's a point in the letters of right after Therese, she's maybe about 2 or 3 years old. Zélie she's dying. She knows she's dying. And she's writing to her dearest of friends, her sister-in-law, Celine. There are so many Celines in this story, so many Thereses, so many Maries. It's just beautiful. But her sister-in-law, Celine, and she is, I'm going to paraphrase it, essentially she's saying, I would suffer this all over again. I would do this if it only meant that Leonie could become a saint. She's dying. She's not writing, I'm worried about Therese. She's not worried about Therese. She's not worried about Celine, Pauline, or Marie. She's worried about Leonie. I will go through all this again. And for me, as a mom and I'll share this, and gladly so, it's been a blessing. My husband, Bruce, and I, we have 3 beautiful children. 2 of them are in the autism spectrum. And when Father Gallagher read that portion from what Zélie had said, I have said that, because you're so worried about that child. You're so worried what's going to happen. I would go through anything. And I would dare to say that those who are listening to us right now, and those who have listened to Father Gallagher's programs on this, I think Therese has, in her beautiful Therese way, for all the prayers of all the moms and all the dads and grandparents and all of the aunts and uncles who have cried out to her since about, at least since in the 80s and 90s when the autism spectrum came up, but with anybody who has had children with disabilities or who have been afraid, they've cried out to Trez, help us. Therese has said in her prayers, look to my mother, look to my sister, look to them, look to this family.
Right.
And you can go to them and they will pray for you and they will help you too. You are not alone. And Leonie, that child who is now a saint, Saint Zélie Martin, this little girl is now a servant of God and on her way. She's on her way.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. I mean, Father Gallagher, maybe you can talk a little bit in a second about the challenges that Leonie had of getting into religious life and how much of a struggle that was for her to actually end up finally becoming a nun. But before we do that, so this was a child that they didn't know about the autistic spectrum and so forth. So they just knew she was a challenge, a huge challenge for that family. And so as you said, Chris, you and other parents who have children that are in that spectrum, they can really relate to that. And they would say, wait, St. Therese had a sister like that? The Martins? Oh my gosh, I had no idea. And she became a woman who could be canonized a saint. I mean, that's just great news. And so I'd like to find out a little bit, well, what were her problems? First of all, tell us a little bit about what were the challenges of Leonie? What were her struggles? And then as a child, but then also, if you could talk a little bit about, she really wanted to become a nun like her sisters, and maybe just describe that whole journey and how long that took.
Yes, I would say, as you just said, Chris, this is a story for everyone because Leonie is a bearer of hope for anyone. It's just a fascinating story in itself, but it will give hope to anyone who reads. But I would say in a very special way, any parents, any family that has struggled with a child in the family and has a difficult upbringing and has really worried deeply, as only, let's say, parents or siblings can, about what's going to become of this child, this is for you. Because this will open up possibilities of grace that, humanly speaking, we would probably hesitate to believe. Well, what were her struggles? Very poor health throughout all of her life. She almost died during the first 18 months of her life. She had, to transliterate the French word, a raging eczema, which at times, any times of stress in her body, in her life would cover her complete body, and it was a terrible torment to her. She was intellectually backward. She always did poorly in her studies. She was always at the bottom. She was emotionally deeply troubled. Just as one example of that, when finally Zélie was able to get her to try boarding school with her aunt, who was a nun, visitation nun, Zélie says it was like heaven for her just not to have Leonie in the house. She would be completely out of control. She would disrupt the entire family. So almost then she goes through a war. They have German soldiers who have conquered, living in their house, a terrible time for her. The sister who was closest to her, Helene, who would have been her companion in life, the way Celine and Therese and Marie and Pauline were for each other. Helene dies when she's 5 years old. And Leonie is at home. She's the only one who's at home because the two older sisters are at boarding school and the two younger are not yet born when the other three children die young. So she goes through all of this turmoil and upset. And I think after talking with Chris, we'll need to hear the psychologists on this, but I would be very surprised if Leonie is not understood to be on the autism spectrum. She bears the signs of that.
Yeah, if I could just interject on that, some of the things that she experienced that a lot of writers don't put in the books that they have, and Father Gallagher was able to kind of bring forward. When she was, right after she was born, it was a difficult pregnancy. When she was born, she was tiny. Then she had, was it scarlet fever, and developed terrible whooping cough. And this is before she's even 18 months old. She had convulsions from the high fevers that really, it's a miracle that she even lived. And that, and then she develops this eczema, her skin, this unbelievable sensitivity. And she has terrible intestinal issues. She's got major gut issues where she's not able to process certain foods. And then she develops, when she's still young, problems with her eyes. Not so much that you can't see, but there's like a rawness. Now I'm only clarifying that because for kids in the autism spectrum, many of them experience those same things in early age. Now, I'm not trying to say that, as Father so rightly puts forward, it will be up to psychologists who actually specialize in this post-mortem, as they call it. We've been talking with psychiatrists and psychologists from the Catholic Psychiatric Association to clarify this. But even if the word came down and it wasn't felt that she was in the spectrum, the emotions and the feelings and the frustrations and the roller coaster and the ups and downs of dealing with a child who's struggling, and Father talked about when the soldiers come and they actually occupy the house. Yeah. Well, where do they find Leonie? 8 years old, down in the basement, in the dark, in the corner, just trying to get herself, because of all the activity, and it's all, and children are dying, Zelly's children, and the emotions within the home, and who's there? Leonie. She's by herself, struggling. So this is, and so she acts out. She's trying to express herself. She can't learn like other kids. So many of us have stories that we know, that have friends who are like that, and other things.
Well, as you both have said, she certainly is a cause for hope for a lot of parents with challenging children. As Father said, you'd have to look far to find a child as challenging as Leonie was, with all her difficulties. So I want to talk a little bit more about her and her vocation. But you mentioned a lot of people don't know that they actually had 9 children, that 4 of them died. Chris, you want to hold up that book cover of the family of saints. You'll see a beautiful icon of the whole family, and you'll see in the middle there that they actually have 4 little ones, and those 4 died at different ages, all young. And so a lot of people don't know that. So this is a family that suffered a lot. They had a lot of suffering in this family. This was not, some people think, oh, that family, they just kind of lived in this glass house of, everything was just rosy and they all became saints. No, they had a lot of suffering, including those 4 children dying, suffering among the other family members, challenges with work. But yet they were so generous to their neighbors, generous to strangers, generous to poor people. We could talk a lot about that, and we won't have time, but people should read the book to find out what made this family so great. They were generous. They were not focused just on themselves. They took care of others. They suffered a lot. Zelia was a great lace maker. She had her own business. She was very good at it. They were just very amazing people, just on a natural level. Not, just take away the spiritual level. They were an incredible family on the natural level. And I think people will be amazed what they find out about that family. But let me just read a quote from Trez from this book about her parents. She said, "God gave me a father and a mother more worthy of heaven than of earth." So as you say, it starts in the family. And her parents are interesting in themselves. You read their stories. They're really both very interesting characters. I mean, I love those people. But here's what I want to read about Zélie. This is a few sentences. This is really important. What did the children mean to them, for them? And this is really important. This is right at the beginning of the book. This is about three or four sentences, but it's important. She said, "When we had our children, our ideas changed. We lived only for them. They were all our happiness, and we never found any happiness except in our children. In short, nothing was too difficult, and the world was no longer a burden for us. For me, our children were a great compensation, so I wanted to have a lot of them in order to raise them for heaven." I mean, that just says it all to me. You know, their whole focus was on their children. And people, she says in the book, people criticized her for having so many children and one's dying. And she said, "Well, of course I was so sad when my children died, but I don't regret that. I'm happy that I had those children. I raised those children for heaven." I don't know if you want to add to that, but I just thought that was remarkable.
Yeah. Yes, you know, when both of them, Zélie and Louis, had first wanted religious life. Zélie had wanted to join a community in Alençon there, and by some kind of divine intuition, the superior refused to let her join. And then Louis tried to be a monk in the Alps in a monastery there, and because he couldn't learn Latin, you know, he was refused. Obviously, God had other plans, and there's a big lesson in that too, you know, that our plans, which seem so clear to us, when they don't materialize, it may well be because God has something much better in store. In this case, as Pius X called Therese, you know, the greatest saint of modern times. Of course, here's a second daughter now canonized. But then they start to, and in the first months of their marriage, they even lived celibately for the first months until finally a priest told them, you know, you're married, you have a responsibility. Well, then everything changed. Once Zélie had the children, as she says in another letter, "I was born to have children." That became her whole life. And she really gave her life and her health and all of her energy for her children, which you see in the letters if you read them.
And if I could add this too, you know, we've heard a lot about Louis, and we love him. We're not trying to keep him out, but he was front and center in Therese's life. And so many of us know about Louis Martin. But we don't know as much about the interaction with Therese and her mother because she was so young when she died. You know, she was only maybe 4 years old. She only lived with her for 3. But Leonie and the other girls, so this, especially the way Father Gallagher has been breaking it open in this new podcast series that we started on Discerning Hearts, you see, I honestly think the way she loved and suffered in love, through love, with love, in helping to break through finally to Leonie. There's a breakthrough moment, and it occurs at one of the most poignant times in this whole story. I think that went a long way in fueling the grace that brought Zélie to sainthood. And it's really a love story of not only just Zélie and Leonie, but it's also, you know, as soon as Leonie lost her mother, and then comes Therese. I mean, it's an extraordinary family that I think we're just beginning to get of this diamond. We see this gorgeous diamond, and we've seen the facet of the heroic story of Therese, but now we're beginning to the parents and the sisters, and you know that aunt and uncle. We all should have an aunt and uncle like Isidore and Celine.
They're in the book.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. They're in the book. I mean, you can learn about all of them in that book. It's an amazing book. It's the definitive book, really, on the family, and we brought it back. I mean, it was written years ago, actually. I do want to mention a book, and I don't know if Christina, who's in the background, could help get it on the screen. But we brought back another book that was came out maybe in the 80s called St. Trez of Lisieux, The Story of a Life. Story of a Life, St. Trez of Lisieux. So it's kind of a takeoff of Story of a Soul. And it's been by Bishop Guy Goucher, who was a Carmelite himself, I believe, and he was the Bishop of Lisieux. So he knew Trez's story intimately. He published, I think, a collection of her writings himself, or edited it or something. So he's really an expert on Trez. And he wrote this book called The Story of a Life, St. Trez of Lisieux. And basically it was to fill out kind of the life of Trez and her family that she doesn't really tell about so much in The Story of a Soul. And so it really does kind of complement The Story of a Soul. I don't have a copy of it here. We might be able to get a picture of it on the screen at some point, but I just want to mention that to people. Since it is the Feast of St. Trez, I want to call people's attention to the book, The Story of a Life, St. Trez of Lisieux by Bishop Guy Goucher. Some people think it's the best biography of her written, and we're happy to publish it.
Well, I just comment on that. I'm going to pronounce it as I would say it in French, Bishop Guy Goucher, but it's spelled Gaucher. Yeah. I would say he is the preeminent writer and scholar on St. Therese. Anything that he's written on Therese or any of the family members is gold. So that book, that's an excellent book, and that's a real service to have made that available for people.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for that. Well, let's go back to Leonie for a second. So, Father, I was talking a little while ago about the struggles she had to realize and find her vocation, her religious vocation, and how she persevered. Could you talk about that journey a little bit?
Now, this is one of the remarkable things about Leonie, and she could do this because her family supported her and she had faith, but she had a will of iron. And her Zélie saw that from a very early age. If she set her heart on something, it didn't matter what kind of defeats or struggles she encountered, she was going to get there. And her entrance into religious life is a major case in point in her life. So her first attempt to join religious life was really, it's a tragic comedy, maybe more emphasis on the tragedy than otherwise, but they have gone down to Alençon from Lisieux. It's a last visit for Marie, who is just about to enter the Carmel. And to the surprise of everyone, when after they visited the Poor Clares, who were a part of their life when they were still living there, Leonie appears behind the grill in the postulant's dress of a Poor Clare, and she has suddenly just entered this community. What the superior was thinking of, Chris and I go through some of that in the podcast that Chris mentioned, but however we judge that, it's the kind of thing that Leonie would do. It's embarrassing, it's painful, it's sudden, it's poorly thought out. I mean, this is Leonie. And she lasts 8 days, and then in shame, her father has to come down and bring her home. A few years later, she tries a second time, and this time with the Visitation Sisters. And this time it lasts 2 months, and in shame and discouragement, she has to return home. A few years later, and this is in the last years of Louis' life, Therese is in the Carmel at this point, and we have a number of letters from Therese during this third attempt. This time it lasts 2 years, but and again, I won't get into all the details, but it was too difficult for her. The eczema, everything happened. And this was probably the lowest point in her life, in her early 30s, which is advanced age in the culture of the time when women would marry at age 15, 16, things like this. For the third time, she is forced in shame to return home. Terribly difficult time for her at this point. And it's really a grace of Therese, because Therese had promised before her death that she would pray for Leonie, that she would be able to be a religious. She makes a fourth attempt, and as she goes in, she says, "This time I am not leaving except on my coffin." And she was there for 41 years in religious life. But it's a fascinating story, and we're going over all kinds of struggles, but Chris and I will be talking about those in the podcast.
Yeah, and they were
good. And before we close, go ahead, Chris. I just want to remind people to check out Discerning Hearts for the podcast. Is it discerninghearts.com? What is the website, Chris?
Just go to discerninghearts.com or go to Discerning Hearts on YouTube. That we have a beautiful video that helps you sort through all the faces and all the people. That's the only, it's a beautiful way to tell the story. But thanks, Tony. Yeah, we hope people that will come there. and to be able to enter into this great story. But just to put a cap on it, I just want to say, and I didn't realize until I read this that Leonie was Therese's confirmation sponsor. So, see what can happen. I mean, the graces that flow from this family are just extraordinary. And I'm so grateful to Ignatius Press. If you go to ignatius.com, you can find all these resources. You've got videos, you have, and not just the books that we've held up, you have so many different resources. And so many of them come over from Europe and are written so beautifully. So thank you to all of you at it.
Oh yeah, no, it's a privilege for us. But you mentioned the video. Could you hold up that DVD you showed earlier? Someone just asked about that.
I'll go grab it. Hold on.
Okay, and I'll just talk about it a little bit. So we have a DVD that was made on the 100th anniversary of Trez's death, I think. And there it is. It's called Saint Therese of the Child Jesus, an Echo of the Heart of God. And you can see there, it's I think it came out in 1997, 100 years after she died, down to the 100th anniversary. And it's a beautiful documentary. It was made in France. It's considered one of the most definitive films about her life, shot on location and so forth. It's in English. But I would definitely recommend that. Very well done. There are other things on her, of course, other films, movies, and so forth. But I would say that's one of the best things if you want to watch something. Chris, were you going to add anything?
Just like that, and I'm sure there'll be more and more for Leonie as time goes on. I mean, there's a grace, there's a or a spigot has been open, and a fire hydrant of stuff on Leonie is starting to come out. But she is a lot of the earlier stuff. They kind of dismiss her and they just make her out like it almost sounds as though she was just a nasty kid. And there were a lot of things going on under there, and you just can't judge that book by that cover. You really can't. Somebody, Father Gallagher, in one of the comments that somebody said, they call her a problem child, and the woman said, there are no problem children. There are children with problems, and that's, you begin again. Non chepi.
Well, one of the things that you see from the earliest years, even as her mother, her aunt, and so forth speak about all the very real problems with Leonie, they will all, it's almost like a refrain. She has a heart of gold, and she did. And that's why she wins you over. And that's why, one of the comments about her is that she never had an enemy in her life. And it's true. She really did. With all her foibles and irritating ways of living and so forth, everyone always knew the goodness that was in her heart. There was stuff for God to work with there.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, and by the way, she is a pretty recent, she's not a canonized saint yet, but she died in 1941. So she's pretty recent in our times. Trez died back in 1897. So again, you see the big, the span there. I mean, Trez is gone for most of her life, and yet the impact that Trez had on Leonie is incredible. As you say, she called herself the first disciple of the little way. It's such a beautiful family story. But I mean, Leonie lived a lot longer than Trez. I mean, she died, I think, in her 70s or something. She died in 1941. So it's kind of a modern story as well.
You could say that Therese shaped the little way and Leonie exemplifies it, in a way that would be hard to beat. But Chris, you had something to say here.
No, I couldn't. What was it? Do you remember the quote about the violet? What did she say about herself?
Yes. Well, Therese says this at the start of the story of a soul, when she's pondering how it is that God seems to give such enormous graces to some and so little to others who hardly even know Jesus and so forth, and how you make sense out of that. And then she looks at flowers, and that gives her answer. You have the rose and all the flowers that really excel, but they wouldn't be as beautiful if you didn't have the constellation of all of these flowers. And she has that line, God made the violet too, which so much exemplifies Leonie that, in fact, one of the biographies written on her uses that as a title, God made the violet too. And that's how Leonie sees herself. I'm just a humble violet, but I'm so happy to be that and to know God's love and to live in that relationship that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I would say, we could talk for days actually on this topic. We basically just scratched the surface, and that's kind of what we do in these discussions is we whet people's appetite for more, and there's certainly plenty more. As you see the book that Chris is holding up, Leonie Martin, A Difficult Life, the sister of St. Trez of Lisieux. Her cause for beatification was open a few years ago. She'll probably be canonized before her other sisters. I mean, think about that. They're all probably saints, so they're the ones that became Carmelites as well, but she's ahead of them. And then the other book... I love it. If you want to hold up the other one, Family of Saints, the name of the author I'll probably butcher, but Father Stéphane Joseph Piat, he was a Franciscan, and again, he was somewhat of a contemporary, I think, of their family, or at least he lived back close to their time. So it's a very authoritative book on the whole family. It's a very fascinating story. And then the one that we don't have a copy of, St. Trez of Lisieux, The Story of a Life by Bishop, I say Guy Goucher, but that's a butcher job as well. And then just the video there.
I could probably get it if we have enough time, but we'll let it go.
Well, that's okay.
I have it in the shelf behind me.
That's how good that book is. That's on Father Gallagher's bookshelf. So if it's on his bookshelf, I mean, what a great endorsement.
Sure, if you want to get it, if it's just turning around to get it, that'd be fine. If you want to grab it, we can show the picture. And while you're looking for it,
here's the video.
So again. There's the film, the St. Trez of Child Jesus, the Echo of the Heart of God, a very fine documentary. So I would encourage people to really get that and check it out.
Okay.
So I want to thank Chris.
Yeah, pray to that family. Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I mean, better read the book, but also pray with them. Pray with the Martin family. I mean, hey, don't forget Pauline, Marie, and Celine. They're available. They're on their way.
That's right. Yeah. Ask for their intercession.
That's right.
Father, did you find the book?
I do have it, but it's an earlier edition, so.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so it's the story of a life, and if you want to read a great biography of Trez, that would be one. All right, so we're going to have to wrap it up here. As I say, we could go on for a long time, but thank you, Father Gallagher, Chris McGregor, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us to talk about St. Trez, Leonie, and the Martin family. Appreciate that. I want to remind people to go to discerninghearts.com to learn more about the work of these two great Catholic leaders here, and to listen to the great podcasts that they both are doing on discerninghearts.com. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. And everyone at Ignatius Press, thank you. You inspire the world. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you.